Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to show you my round 6 game from the Bošnjaci Open. So I faced an 1800 rated opponent. He's young, I would say 14, 15, 16, something like that. So the rating, well, when you play young players, the rating could be 300 points higher, or it could be 200 points lower. It could also be optimal, who knows. Also, there were no games online. So I had no idea what was going to happen, and my opponent played e4. I've decided to play c6, the Caro-Kann, because if I'm going to play something without prep, I may as well be familiar with the positions. So d4, d5. And my opponent took and went for the Panov. So the Panov is an interesting opening from a Caro-Kann player's perspective. I have to say I'm not a big fan of playing the black side of this, and I would much rather play against the classical or the advance or something, because the Panov is as unlike the Caro-Kann as you can get. The positions aren't in the typical Caro-Kann structure, and it's usually way more open. In any case, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. And now white has two main moves, bishop g5 or knight f3. My opponent played bishop g5. And I have something else prepared, which I have been looking at for a while, but I'm more familiar with bishop e6 than with this other variation, which will remain undisclosed for now. So I played bishop e6 once again. And white's main move is a3. White's idea in the Panov is to go c5, b4, and basically queen the c pawn eventually, or the b pawn, because after c5, white has a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side, whereas black's pawn majority is pretty immobile because there's a bishop on e6. So after a3, queen d7, bishop e2, black rushes to overprotect the d pawn, and the game goes on. But my opponent played knight f3, which is fine. This is a normal move. I went to g6, and black's idea is bishop to g7 and put pressure on d4 eventually. If white doesn't take the knight now, then black has an edge already. For example, bishop e2, bishop g7, castles, knight e4 is already scary because the d pawn is hanging, and if you take, you lose the d pawn. Probably black should castle first, but I'm just saying taking the knight is correct, which is what my opponent did. So takes. And c5. And of course I knew this position, and also c5 is the most thematic move. You want to go b4 and push the pawn. That's a bit harder to do without a3, so you either play a3, b4, or you prepare b4 in a different way. In any case, bishop to g7. And in this position, I knew only one move, only one idea, and that's bishop b5. Black castles, white goes h3. The idea behind h3 is to prevent bishop g4, which in turn defends the d pawn. And both bishop b5 and bishop and h3 against bishop g4 are directed to protect the d pawn. Also, bishop b5 may have an idea behind it to take on c6 and push the b pawn. But my opponent played bishop e2, and I was really unsure what to do here. So I should castle first. I was thinking about bishop to g4 now and just exchanging, but I didn't really want to have a position like this where I take, and I have to defend this pawn with my knight, and then rook e1 and I resign. So that really wasn't an option. So I just castled first. My opponent castled as well. And once again, bishop g4 is an option, but not a good one. I mean, I'm not really sure what to do after bishop g4. I'm not sure I want to take that knight, because d pawn will be under more pressure. d5 will be under more pressure than d4. So I had a long think here. And this is the first position I really didn't know, where I really didn't know what to do. I should say I did not engine check the game. I have no idea whether I played correctly here. My guess is that my move b6 is okay. b6 is a pretty common way to disrupt this pawn chain, and if you've seen my last Panov game, well, go back a few videos in the playlist, and I had a pretty successful opening against the Panov. So b6, especially if white cannot play b4, is a devastating threat. So for example, If this is taken, then, you know, isolated d-pawn, very strong position for black. If white plays a3, for example, to prepare b4, then this is taken, and now my bishop is extremely good. So, against b6, my opponent played the move I had been expecting. Actually, I was expecting bishop b5, but queen a4 is the same idea. He played queen a4. Let's just go back. Instead of b6, I had another idea which could work, and that's g5. Now, I've seen g5 played in many positions like these. It's an aggressive move that threatens to advance with g4 in some cases and pick up the d-pawn, but it also prepares a pawn advance on the king side with either f5 or h5, and it could provide a square for the bishop on g6, which is useful, without allowing knight h4. So it's a triple purpose move, but it's extremely risky, and I wanted to play a move that I understood better. So here was my calculation. b6. If bishop b5, I was going to play queen c7. And this seemed perfectly fine to me. Now, unless my opponent takes the knight on c6, b4 is unplayable, so probably takes and then b4. Where I have the bishop pair, my opponent's queen side is advancing, but I don't really think it's too scary, especially since the pawn on d4 is still weak, so something like bishop g4 really could be dangerous now. For example, I don't know, a4 takes, queen takes, rook d8 to defend the pawn. My opponent creates a pass pawn, and that's fine, but now I have f5, and I don't know. This seemed interesting. I have a6 to at least trade off one pair of pawns, and d4 is going to be under constant threat. I can also consider sacrificing an exchange with rook e8, rook e4. Maybe. I wasn't sure about that, but it was an idea. But my opponent played queen a4, and the difference between queen a4 and bishop b5, they both attack the knight, but with queen a4, my opponent's knight is still able to come to b5, which I haven't considered at all, really. I was gonna go queen c7 against both moves. But now if I go queen c7, maybe knight b5, knight d6 is scary. So queen d7, knight d6. Now that I look at it, it's not scary at all. This is what I should have done, because now I can take, and my bishop is wide open. Any b4 runs into f5, and the diagonal is just wide open. Also, I may be able to take on c5 at some point and make the knight unstable. So I should have gone queen c7. Because knight b5, I just go queen d7. Instead, I went queen d7, which makes no sense. And I'm sure this is a mistake. We'll see with the engine, but it's definitely uncomfortable now. The reason I went queen d7, and I'm going to be completely honest here, is because I thought I could take on d4 if my opponent plays b4, which is idiotic. Because I was expecting, okay, wait, b4 blocks the queen's defense of this pawn. And then if my opponent takes my queen, I can throw in knight e2 check, and then take the queen and I'm up a pawn. Completely missing the fact that the knight defends the queen, and that on knight d4 my opponent just takes the knight. So when my opponent played b4, I just went, why did I do this? This is the tactic. I was going to go here. And of course, if queen takes queen, then knight e2. And this is great. Unfortunately, on knight d4, my opponent just takes a free knight because the queen's defended. So that didn't work. And now I have a problem to solve. Bishop b5 is coming, and I'm going to have to play rook c8. So if I go queen c7, then I have accomplished nothing, and knight b5, knight d6 can still happen. So I went bc5 to at least prevent b5, c6. Okay? bc5, and now I played the worst move of the game. The next move is the beginning of a 10 move or 15 move long problem that I was trying to solve throughout the entire middle game. I basically lost 2 tempi with a single move because I played a careless move. I thought, okay, just make a normal move. This is a simple position. It's not a simple position. This is a very tough position for black because my queen is on d7. I figured, okay, rook's on c8, b8, the knight's defended, then I move my queen away and it seems fine. No, no, no. I played rook a b8, and this is such an awful move. It looks natural, trying to get into b4 and getting my rook to an open file, but it's, as you're going to see, in 2 moves, I'm going to bring that rook back to a8. It's that bad. Instead, I should have gone bishop h6. And bishop h6 has a very specific idea in mind. This is something I wanted to do later. It plays against rook b1 and the rook's being doubled on the b file because I also have bishop f5. And with the bishop on h6, my opponent is never going to double rooks on the b file. Let's just put it that way. Now, why is rook a b8 bad? Well, because after bishop b5, I can either put the f rook on c8, which is what I did, or I can waste a whole tempo playing rook bc8, which makes no sense if you played rook a b8. So here. And now when my opponent plays rook a b1, I just have to put my rook back on a8, because my rook is hanging. It's hanging. If I go rook b7, then bishop a6 picks up an exchange and I resign. And if I don't do anything, let's say, I don't know, random move, then my opponent takes and takes and takes either the queen or the rook. It doesn't really matter. And I'm down a full rook. The rook is undefended. So after rook a b1, I went rook a8. And this is sort of admitting my mistake. I think, I'm sorry, the drilling started. My neighbors have been doing construction work for over 2 years now. I made a joke the other day in the comments that they must be drilling a tunnel to... Now my phone's ringing. No! Give me a second. Okay, so I put the rook back on a8 because the rook was hanging. My opponent played rook b3, and now I really didn't know what to do, so I went bishop f5. And at least I'm preventing rook b1. I was expecting knight h4, but my opponent played queen a6, excuse me, and I went bishop f8. Now knight h4, I have to bring my bishop back, so my opponent plays rook fb1, but now g5, I mean it's risky, but I have to chase the rooks away, and rook 1 to b2. And now I have gained something. Firstly, you can see that if my bishop was on h6, I'd have a really good position now with bishop to c1. Almost winning an exchange, but definitely chasing the rook away from the b file. And also, after rook 1 to b2, my opponent's back rank is weak. So you have to bear in mind that any queen e6 idea, along with g4, almost wins the game. There is knight d2, knight f1, but it almost wins the game. So you have to watch out for your back rank. Okay, I played king g7 here. I wanted to see what my opponent was going to do. I don't have a way to improve my position. That's very unfortunate, but unless I play bishop g6, h6, f5, g4, I'm not making progress. I was trying to make moves like bishop e4 work, but they don't. I was trying to make moves like, I don't know. Nothing works on d4 because my queen is still tied down to the knight. So my opponent played queen a4. Again, increasing the pressure on the spin on c6, and I went queen e6. Now queen e6 unpins and prepares some mating threats. If rook e2, then I would have just gone back to d7. Instead, on queen e6, my opponent played bishop a6, which, I mean, I was relatively happy to see because I had calculated into a much worse position, but at least I'm not losing material by force in the position I had calculated. So I went about 8 moves deep here. And the calculation is all forcing, it's all single moves, and it's a very straight line, so I had calculated correctly. I had also evaluated correctly that white is much better, but I couldn't see what else to do. So, I mean, I went rook c7. I don't know what else. If I go rook e8, I just lose because of bishop b7. So rook c7. My opponent played bishop b7 anyway, and now at least I'm not hanging an entire piece, or an entire exchange. But now I had gone for the variation the 8 move line. So I sack the exchange and I win it back. It's just a temporary exchange sacrifice. Rook takes b7 and now g4. The idea behind g4 is that if you go knight d2, I can now go queen e1, knight f1 and bishop d3, winning the game. And if you go knight h4, attacking my bishop, I go to c8 and I just take your rook eventually. Sorry, you have to throw in rook e2 first, excuse me. If you don't throw in rook e2, if you move the knight, then I mate you. So rook e2 first, queen c8, attacking the rook, and knight h4. If you move the rook, I've taken 2 pieces for a rook. If you play knight h4, then I take your rook, you take my bishop, we check. Unfortunately, king g7 was a bad waiting move for this variation. If I hadn't played king g7, this whole idea with bishop b7 would be losing for white. I have, so what can you do? Still, I couldn't see what else to do. I couldn't see an alternative to this trade. We will check with the engine at the end of the game. So rook e2, queen c8, knight h4, takes, and I went king h8. The reason I went king h8 is so that I don't stay on g8, so that I don't allow any knight checks. But unfortunately, king h8 comes with its own set of problems because knight b5, knight d6, knight f7 is with check and f7 isn't defended. Also knight d6, knight f7. Also rook d8, protecting my pawn, would fail to a fork in many positions. So I ended up having to move my king again. On king h8, I offered a draw because I thought I was much worse. And I think I am much worse. My opponent, of course, declined. I played g3. My opponent played g3, and now this pawn is kind of loose. Of course, he couldn't take it immediately because here, and that's it. I'm mating you. So g3, preventing mate, and now h5. And before I played h5, I had a very long think. I don't think white can take this pawn because there's such a long line in which I wouldn't say black is better, but I wouldn't say black is worse either. If you take here, this is a knight trade. So queen b1, king g2, queen f5, queen c6. But now the problem is that I have queen f3. If you defend the rook, it's mate. King f1, queen h1 mate. If you don't defend the rook, then I take the rook. You take here, and at least I have a draw. At least. At least. Okay, now that I see it once again, I would have gone for a draw because it's hopeless. I have to go for a draw. Yeah, black is worse. Unless I have... Okay, yeah. Never mind. If my opponent had taken the d-pawn with the knight, I would have gone for this draw. This is as far as I saw. Without the engine, though, so maybe I've missed something. In any case, on h5, my opponent went queen c2. Now the pawn is under fire. Rook d8. And queen d3. I don't really understand queen d3. I think my opponent wanted to go knight d6 in some cases, but I don't know. And now I found an idea which, in my opinion, equalizes if allowed. Again, we will check. My opponent saves the back rank, and my idea was queen c4. Now, if the queens are not traded, then my queen is much better than my opponent's queen, and d4 and a2 are constantly under threat. Also, the knight cannot come into b5 or a4. If the queens are traded, which is what happened in the game, then the d-pawn is under fire. There are 2 ways to defend the d-pawn. Rook d1 fails to a very simple tactic, bishop takes c5. So not rook d1. Knight b5 is the other way to defend. So my opponent went knight b5. And here, also, yeah, excuse me, I don't think you have to defend the pawn. I think I found the win here for white. Just rook b1, giving up the pawn. I don't think I can take that pawn. If takes, rook takes, c6, resigns. Seems about right, because if you want to stop me from queening, then you go rook d8, and then when I go c7, we have to go rook c8, and then I go rook b8, and that's the end of the game. So I think on rook b1 I wouldn't have taken the pawn. Not that I've calculated this in advance, but I don't think I can take that pawn. It's just losing. So my opponent went knight b5. And I have considered a6, but it seemed like a bad idea because of knight d6. And now, again, I have to prevent this. And I was looking at king g8 or king h7, but I would like to tempt my opponent to take the pawn because taking the pawn doesn't work. On knight takes f7, I go rook d5, and the d pawn is going to fall. My opponent needs to save one of the knights. So let's say, I don't know, knight d6. Now I take. If pawn takes, I take the knight. If knight takes, I take on d4. And now the pawn is hanging, the knight is hanging, and I have a passed pawn on c4. But I couldn't make all of that work in my head when I was visualizing that. It's easy when you're putting stuff on the board, but when I was trying to visualize it, I just wasn't sure that I wasn't hanging a pawn or a fork or something. So I played a normal move, king g8, preventing all of that. And I'm sure my opponent is winning here. I'm sure with precise engine play, black stands no chance because of the knight on f5, because of the d6 square, because this passed pawn is protected and mine isn't. But for some reason, my opponent played a very, very simple tactical error, which I've shown you already, rook d1. And now the tables have turned. I can take on c5, but it's not just that. It's that the d pawn is about to fall, and that the f2 square is so weak that black is the one playing for a win now. I don't really know what to suggest here for white. My opponent took once. Played rook c1. I took on d4 and they took once because both knights are hanging. If rook d1, I just win the rook because of knight f3 check. So takes, bishop takes, rook takes c4, and simply bishop b6. And if I had to guess the evaluation here, I would say -2, maybe 1.5. But the f2 square is so weak. It's just incredibly hard to defend. And there are two things you have to worry about, rook d1 and rook d2. I think rook d1 is less of a threat, so my opponent, I think, should have gone rook c2. He didn't, he went knight c3, so now rook d2. And now rook f4 is the only way to defend, unless you want to go knight e4, giving up a pawn. But okay, knight e4 takes, knight f6, I don't know, here. And I'm guessing this is good enough and just push my pawn. But my opponent went rook f4, and now I set a simple trap up, king g7. If you play rook f6, hoping to play knight e4, I don't take the rook, I play bishop d4, and that wins a piece. Also, I could take on f6, and I'm sure I'm still much better because my king is in the middle of white's position. This I didn't see during the game. I had played king g7 with the intention to play bishop d4. My opponent played a4. Now bishop d4, and all I have to do is chase the rook away from this optimal position and then bring my bishop to d4. So what I want to do is go bishop e5, chase the rook to the other side, and then go back to d4 and just overwhelm f2. That was my plan. So bishop d4 with tempo on the knight. Whoa, excuse me. My opponent played knight b5, and now bishop e5. The rook has to move. On rook f5, I just win the rook with king g6. So rook c4, and now all I have to do is get the d4 square for my bishop. So I played a6. And my opponent, unfortunately, played another very, very bad move, knight c3, and I just win the knight. I don't have to take the f2 pawn. So here he resigned. If, for example, knight a3, not losing the knight, then bishop d4, and you lose anyway. Because, you know, I'm going to take on f2. So not a good win, not a clean win. I guess I was losing, but we will see. I got lucky in this one. Okay, let's turn on the engine. So c5, I know this position. Bishop e2, I'm not familiar with already. 4 games. Castles is fine. Castles is fine. Okay, g5 played twice, b6 once, a6 once. I don't understand a6. I do understand g5. Okay, it's all equal. After b6, it's 0.3. Okay, so it's not a big deal. And in the one game that had been played, bishop b5 was played. Okay, in my game, queen a4. Equal. Queen c7 equal queen d7 0.4. Yeah, queen c7 just made more sense. Okay, b4. Oh, bc is a mistake. I was looking at this a6 idea, and I was only looking at cb and queen b7, but on a6 my opponent doesn't have to take. My opponent can just ignore the b pawn. So I actually saw a6 during the game, but I couldn't figure it out. What else? The engine says queen c7, queen b7. Okay, I took on c5. Now white is 0.7, bc, and rook ab8 has to be +1 or more. Okay, plus 0.9. It's just such an awful move. Bishop b5, rook fc8. Ugh. Yeah, now rook a8 best move. That I know, because it's the only move. Rook b3, bishop f5, queen a6, bishop f8 is fine, knight h4, bishop e6, rook fb1. Okay, g5, yeah, it's not a big difference. At least I'm chasing the knight away. Bishop f5, rook 1b2. King g7 is weird. Without king g7, my tactic would have worked. Queen a4, queen e6. Oh my god, it's +2. I should have gone bishop e6. Towards what end? It doesn't do anything. I didn't know what to do. Okay, bishop a6. Rook c7, bishop b7. Okay, the engine says rook d8, knight d4? What's knight d4? Oh, if you take with the knight, I mate you. But if you take with the queen, what's the point? Bishop c5, no, no. Okay, so I went for this trade, which isn't good. Okay. The line is forced. Wait, it's not forced. What? I shouldn't have gone queen c8. Queen c8, knight h4, bishop d3. Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't even consider not taking the rook. But yeah, the knight on f5 is better than my rook anyway. g3, h5 +3. Okay, queen c2 second best. Let's... Okay, rook d8, queen d3 is good. Wow, okay. Queen b4 +4. Oh, queen a6, a simple double attack. Oh. Yeah, and if we trade knights, then my opponent queens the c-pawn. Rook e1, queen c4. Okay, slightly less bad. Queen c4, dc4, knight b5. Almost equal. Okay. So let me guess that rook b1 works. Rook b1 and I cannot take on d4. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So knight b5. I should have gone a6. I should have gone a6. But yeah, I couldn't visualize it. Let's check that. a6, knight d6. And now king h7 or king g8. I think I would have played king h7. And if knight f7, black is better after rook d5? Oh, okay. Knight d6 is the most logical human move, and now just bishop takes. Yeah, knight takes and knight d4. Wow. I got this far, but I wasn't sure that I had calculated correctly. So knight b5, I went king g8, which is +2 again. If white plays rook c1, that makes sense. But fortunately for me, white played rook d1. Oh. And yeah, black is better. Takes... Oof. Oof. At some point here, my opponent offered the draw, and now I declined. I was losing when I offered. He was losing when he offered, so I guess that's fair. Knight c3, rook d2, rook f4, king g7 is fine, a4, bishop d4. I should have gone king g6. Nah, bishop d4 has to be okay. Knight b5, bishop e5, rook c4, a6 has to be best. Yeah, and now on knight a3, I'm guessing bishop d4 is winning. Yeah. Okay, so definitely not a clean game. Not a good game by either of us. He played well in the first part and then blundered. And I would say I played worse than my opponent. He outplayed me all the way until rook d1. He played almost perfectly and he played a great game. I had no idea what was going on, had a slight disadvantage and then a losing position within a couple of moves. So I think my opponent earned at least half a point, if not a full point in this game. But as you've seen many of my games, having a winning position means nothing. So yeah, good luck to him in the future. I'm sure he will be a very strong player. And to the rest of you, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, comment below. I'll see you tomorrow. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.